Benjamin Crawford's weathered hand froze mid-reach toward his wallet, the auctioneer's hammer suspended in deadly silence above the makeshift platform. $200, 10 times what any sane man would pay for child labor, hung in the suffocating Phoenix air like a prayer. This wasn't about buying help for his barren ranch. The Irish girl's blue eyes cut through the crowd of leering men, her defiant stare burning straight into his soul. At 16, Hope Sullivan stood chained like livestock, yet somehow she was the only person in that godforsaken warehouse who wasn't afraid. A well-dressed gentleman in the front row cursed and spat tobacco juice. "Fool rancher's lost his damn mind!" The crowd erupted in nervous laughter, but their eyes betrayed something darker. Hunger temporarily denied. Margaret would ask why he'd spent their winter savings on a stranger. How could Ben explain that this broken child reminded him of the daughter they'd mourned for 20 years, the empty cradle that still sat in their locked nursery? "Sold to the gentleman from Crawford Ranch." The hammer fell like a gunshot. What had he just done? And why did Hope Sullivan look at him like she already knew his secrets? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Crawford Ranch sprawled across the Arizona territory like a monument to stubborn hope, its weathered buildings standing defiant against 20 years of drought and disappointment. Benjamin Crawford had built every fence post and barn beam with his own calloused hands, dreaming of children's laughter echoing across the dusty courtyard. Instead, only the wind spoke here, whispering through empty corrals that should have been filled with ponies for little ones to ride. At 52, Ben carried the weight of broken promises in his shoulders. His hair had gone silver, waiting for sons to teach ranching, daughters to spoil with store-bought ribbons. The Homestead Act had promised land and legacy, but the land had given him everything except what mattered most. Margaret Crawford stood at the kitchen window, her 45 years etched in the worry lines around eyes that had once sparkled with wedding day dreams. Every morning for 2 decades, she set 3 plates on the dining table, a ritual of faith that had become a monument to loss. The 3rd plate waited empty, just as the nursery upstairs remained locked, its hand-carved crib gathering dust like a shrine to children who never came. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Maggie whispered to herself, the same prayer she'd whispered through 18 years of failed pregnancies, through the final devastating diagnosis that closed her womb forever. Her hands, trained in battlefield medicine during the war between the states, had saved countless lives but couldn't create the one life she desperately wanted. The ranch reflected their inner landscape, vast, capable, but somehow barren. Cattle grazed in distant pastures, testament to Ben's skill as a rancher. The bank account stayed healthy, the land productive. Yet the main house echoed with the hollowness of dreams deferred, conversations cut short by the absence of small voices asking endless questions. Ben had built a 3-bedroom house for a family of 5. Margaret had planted flower gardens where children could hide during games of seek and find. They'd installed a rope swing on the old oak tree, its empty ark mocking them every sunset. The local preacher spoke of God's plan, but what divine purpose required such cruel emptiness? Their marriage had survived the disappointment, love deepened by shared grief. They worked side by side without need for words, understanding measured in glances across dinner tables set for 2 instead of many. Ben would find Margaret standing in the doorway of the locked nursery, her fingers tracing the wooden nameplate they'd never needed to carve. She would catch him staring at children in town, his face reflecting a hunger that no amount of prosperity could satisfy. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly, but nothing burned hotter than the question that haunted every childless couple on the frontier. What good was building a legacy if there was no one to inherit it? Ben had acres of prime grazing land, herds of prize cattle, and a house designed for laughter. all of it meaningless without small hands to pass it to. Tonight, that empty third plate would finally be filled. The wagon wheels carved deep ruts in the desert dust as Ben guided his horses away from Phoenix, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the scrubland. Hope Sullivan sat rigid beside him on the bench seat, her torn calico dress doing little to hide the purple bruises that decorated her arms like ugly jewelry. She hadn't spoken since they'd left the auction house, but her eyes never stopped moving, cataloging every landmark, every turn, every potential escape route with the calculating precision of someone who'd learned that survival depended on knowing the way out. Ben stole glances at his unexpected passenger, noting how she held herself like a coiled spring, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Her red hair caught fire in the desert light, but it was her eyes that held his attention, blue as forget-me-nots, yet old beyond her 16 years. Those were eyes that had seen too much, survived too much. "You planning to run off?" he asked after they'd been traveling for an hour, his voice gentle but direct. "Depends," Hope replied without looking at him, her Irish accent softened by years in America, but still lilting through her words like music over broken glass. "On what?" She turned to study his weathered face, taking in the premature silver at his temples, the lines carved by desert sun and disappointment. "On whether you bought me to work or for other reasons." The quiet steel in her voice made Ben's stomach clench with understanding. He'd heard whispers about what happened to pretty girls sold at such auctions, seen the hunger in certain men's eyes back in that warehouse. He pulled the wagon to a halt and turned to face her fully, his brown eyes meeting her defensive stare. "Miss Sullivan, I want to be clear about something. You're coming to my ranch to help with honest work, cooking, cleaning, tending the garden. Nothing more. Any man who would harm a child deserves to be strung up, and I include myself in that judgment." Hope studied his face for a long moment, her gaze searching for the lie she'd learned to expect from every adult. Instead, she found only tired sincerity and something else, a deep well of pain that matched her own. Finally, she nodded. "All right then, Mr. Crawford." They rode in more comfortable silence after that, the tension in Hope's shoulders easing slightly as the miles passed. She watched him handle the horses with practiced skill, noting how he spoke gently to the animals, how his hands remained steady, even when rattlesnakes sunned themselves on rocks near the trail. This was a man who understood living things, who treated them with respect, rather than cruelty. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they crested a hill, and Hope got her first look at the Crawford Ranch. It spread across the valley below like a small town, the main house built of solid timber with a wraparound porch and dormer windows that caught the golden light. A large barn stood to one side with corrals and outbuildings scattered across the property. Cattle dotted the pastures that stretched toward the distant hills, and she could see the glint of water from what must be a well or stream. "It's bigger than I expected," Hope said softly, and for the first time since Phoenix, her voice held something other than wariness. "Took me 15 years to build it up," Ben replied with quiet pride that couldn't quite hide the underlying sadness. "Course it'll all belong to strangers when I'm gone, seeing as Margaret and I haven't been blessed with children." Something flickered across Hope's face at those words, recognition, perhaps, or understanding of a different kind of loss. She'd learned that everyone carried wounds, but childless couples wore theirs like invisible shackles, binding them to dreams that grew heavier with each passing year. As they pulled up to the main house, a woman emerged onto the porch, and Hope's breath caught. Margaret Crawford was still beautiful at 45, with honey-colored hair only lightly touched with silver and a figure that spoke of good living. But there was something in her posture, a careful way she held herself that suggested years of disappointment carefully contained. "Benjamin," Margaret called as he climbed down from the wagon. "You're later than I expected." "Had some business in town," he replied, then turned to help Hope down from the wagon. His hands were gentle but impersonal, treating her with the same respectful care he'd shown his horses. "Margaret, this is Hope Sullivan. She'll be helping around the house." Margaret's eyes widened as she took in the girl's ragged appearance, the too thin frame and haunted expression. "My lord, child, you look like you haven't had a proper meal in months." "Probably hasn't," Ben said quietly. "I was thinking she could have the small room off the kitchen." "Nonsense," Margaret said briskly, maternal instincts overwhelming caution. "She'll have the spare bedroom upstairs. Come along, dear. Let's get you cleaned up and fed." Hope hesitated at the threshold, one foot on the porch step, the other still planted in the dust. For 3 years she'd survived by trusting no one, by always being ready to run. But something about the way Margaret Crawford looked at her, with genuine concern rather than calculation, made her chest tighten with an emotion she'd almost forgotten. 2 weeks had passed since Hope Sullivan arrived at the Crawford Ranch, and the careful rhythms of their new life had begun to settle like dust after a storm. She worked alongside Margaret in the kitchen each morning, her quick hands learning to knead bread and churn butter with the efficiency of someone who understood that usefulness meant survival. But it was the evenings that revealed the true transformation taking place, when Ben would call her into his study after supper, where lamplight flickered over ledger books and maps, and Hope discovered she had a hunger for learning that matched her hunger for safety. "Show me again how to calculate the feed costs per head of cattle," Ben said, sliding a worn notebook across the desk. His weathered fingers traced columns of numbers that told the story of the ranch's prosperity and struggles. Hope bent over the page, her red hair catching the golden light as she worked through the mathematics with careful precision. "If we have 200 head and each needs 30 pounds of feed per day at 2 cents per pound, that's—" She paused, her brow furrowed in concentration. "$12 daily or $360 monthly?" "Good. And if feed prices rise to 3 cents per pound? $540 monthly, a difference that could break a smaller operation." Ben leaned back in his leather chair, studying the girl who had transformed from a frightened waif into something approaching a partner in just 14 days. Her mind was sharp as a Damascus blade, cutting through complex problems with an intuition that amazed him. More than that, she seemed to genuinely care about the ranch's welfare, asking thoughtful questions about water rights and grazing rotation that showed real engagement with their work. "Hope," he said carefully, "can I ask you something?" She looked up from the ledger, wariness flickering across her features like shadow over sunlight. Even after 2 weeks of kindness, she still carried herself like someone ready to run at the first sign of danger. "You learn these things awful fast, faster than most grown men I've taught. Where did you pick up such a head for numbers?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the oil lamp. Hope's fingers tightened around her pencil, and Ben could see the internal war playing out across her expressive features, the battle between truth and the safety of secrets. "I had to be good with numbers," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where I came from, knowing how much something was worth could mean the difference between eating and starving, between safety and—" She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. Ben waited, recognizing the fragile moment when trust balanced on a knife's edge. He'd learned patience in his years of working with spooked horses and wounded cattle. Sometimes the kindest thing was to simply be present without pushing. "Mr. Crawford?" Hope said suddenly, her blue eyes meeting his with startling intensity. "That day at the auction, why did you bid so much for me? $200 could have bought you 3 strong boys or 5 younger children. Why spend so much on one girl?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. In truth, he'd been asking himself the same thing for 2 weeks, trying to understand the compulsion that had driven him to empty his wallet for a stranger. How could he explain the moment when her defiant stare had reached across that crowded warehouse and grabbed hold of something deep in his chest? "I saw something in your eyes," he said honestly. "Something that reminded me of myself at your age. A determination to survive no matter what. I respected that. And Mrs. Crawford. She doesn't mind having another mouth to feed, another person taking up space in her house?" Ben's expression softened with understanding. "Hope, Margaret lost a baby many years ago. Since then she's carried an emptiness that no amount of prosperity could fill. You've given her something to nurture again, something to care for. If anything, you've been a gift to both of us." Hope absorbed this information in silence, processing the implications. She'd noticed how Margaret's face lit up when teaching her to cook special dishes, how the older woman seemed to find excuses to touch her hair or adjust her collar with the gentle fussiness of a mother hen. It was a kind of attention Hope had never experienced. Care without expectation, affection without strings attached. "There's something else I need to tell you," Hope said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "About where I came from, about why I was at that auction." Ben set down his pen and gave her his full attention, sensing that whatever she was about to reveal would change everything. "I wasn't just picked up off the streets like most of those children. I was running from someone who's probably still looking for me." The words hung heavy in the air, confirming Ben's growing suspicions that Hope Sullivan carried secrets darker than simple poverty or abandonment. 3 years ago, I lived at a place called the Christian Workhouse outside Tucson. It was run by a preacher named Reverend Josiah Whitmore. He told folks in town that he was saving orphaned children, giving them shelter and Christian education, but that wasn't what happened there. Hope's hands began to shake slightly, and she clasped them together to still the tremor. The Reverend, he believed that children were born sinful and that suffering would purify our souls. He called it divine discipline, but what he did to us, what he made us do. She couldn't finish, but Ben could read the truth in her haunted expression, in the way she unconsciously rubbed her wrists where faint scars showed pale against her skin. One night, his wife, Mary Whitmore, she tried to stop him from hurting some of the younger children. I saw him kill her, pushed her down the stairs when she threatened to go to the authorities. Then he told everyone she'd had an accident. Ben's blood ran cold. "You witnessed a murder?" "Yes, sir. And the Reverend knows I saw. That's why I've been running. That's why I ended up at that auction." Hope met his eyes with desperate honesty. "Mr. Crawford, if he finds out where I am, he'll come for me, and anyone protecting me might get hurt too." The confession hung between them like a loaded gun, and Ben understood that their quiet ranch life had just become infinitely more complicated and dangerous. The revelation about Reverend Whitmore cast a shadow over the Crawford Ranch that seemed to darken with each passing day. Ben had spent sleepless nights pacing the porch, his military instincts from the war between the states awakening like a sleeping bear. Every dust cloud on the horizon made his hand drift toward the Colt .45 at his hip. Every creak of the house settling made him pause and listen for sounds that didn't belong. Margaret had taken the news with the stoic grace of a woman who'd seen too much death during her years as an army nurse. "That poor child," she'd whispered, pulling Hope closer in a protective embrace that spoke louder than words. "No wonder she startles at sudden movements. No wonder she checks every door and window before settling in for the night." Hope, for her part, seemed almost relieved to have shared her burden. The constant vigilance that had kept her spine rigid began to soften slightly, though she still insisted on keeping her small travel bag packed and hidden under her bed, just in case. She threw herself into ranch work with renewed energy, as if staying busy could keep the demons of memory at bay. But it was during the 3rd week of October that the first sign of trouble appeared. Ben was teaching Hope to repair fence posts in the north pasture when she suddenly went rigid, her face pale as winter frost. She was staring at a dust cloud approaching from the direction of town, still miles away but distinct against the clear desert sky. "Hope, what is it?" "Riders," she whispered, dropping the hammer she'd been holding. "3 of them, riding hard." That's how his men always traveled, fast and with purpose. Ben shaded his eyes against the afternoon sun, studying the approaching figures. Even at this distance, he could see they weren't local ranchers making a social call. These men rode with the urgency of a mission, their horses lathered despite the cool October air. "Get back to the house," he told Hope, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Tell Margaret to prepare the root cellar. If these men are who you think they are, you'll need to stay hidden." Hope didn't argue. She'd learned to trust Ben's judgment over the past month, but more than that, she'd learned to recognize the look in his eyes. The same cold calculation she'd seen in veteran soldiers who'd survived too many battles to take chances with civilian lives. By the time the riders reached the ranch yard, Ben was waiting on the front porch, his rifle propped casually against the porch railing within easy reach. Margaret stood beside him, her face composed, but her knuckles white where she gripped her apron. The lead rider was a tall, thin man with the kind of pale complexion that spoke of too much time indoors. His black coat and white collar marked him as clergy, but there was nothing holy in the cold gray eyes that surveyed the Crawford property with calculating intensity. Behind him rode 2 younger men, their faces bearing the hard-set expressions of men who'd learned to follow orders without question. "Good afternoon," the minister called out, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a Sunday sermon. "I'm Reverend Josiah Whitmore from the Christian Workhouse near Tucson. I'm looking for a young girl who went missing from our care some time ago. Irish girl, red hair, about 16 years old. She's troubled, I'm afraid. Prone to telling stories." Ben felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. "Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description, Reverend. Not many children pass through this part of Arizona." Whitmore's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "I understand your caution, Mr. Crawford. But this child is very dear to our hearts. She was traumatized by the death of her parents, and I'm afraid the shock affected her mind. She's been telling fantastic tales about our ministry, accusing us of terrible things. It breaks my heart to see what grief can do to a young soul." The practiced lies rolled off Whitmore's tongue like honey, sweet and poisonous. Ben had heard similar stories during the war, men who could justify any atrocity with righteous words and wounded expressions. "That does sound troubling," Ben replied carefully. "But as I said, we haven't seen hide nor hair of any missing girls. You might try the Hendersons' place to the west. They sometimes take in strays." One of Whitmore's companions leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes scanning the ranch buildings with professional interest. "Mind if we water our horses? It's been a long ride from town." "Of course," Margaret spoke up, her voice steady despite the fear Ben could read in her posture. The well's just beyond the barn. As the men dismounted and led their horses toward the water, Ben caught sight of movement in the hayloft window, just a glimpse of red hair before it disappeared. Hope was watching, and he could only pray she'd stay hidden until these wolves in sheep's clothing moved on. Whitmore lingered near the porch, his gaze taking in every detail of the ranch with unnerving thoroughness. "Fine spread you have here, Mr. Crawford. Must take a lot of work to maintain all this." "My wife and I manage well enough." "Just the 2 of you? No children to help with the chores?" The question seemed casual, but Ben heard the probing edge beneath Whitmore's conversational tone. "The Lord hasn't blessed us with children," Margaret replied. and Ben heard the genuine pain in her voice, pain that Whitmore seemed to catalog with predatory interest. "Ah, that's unfortunate. Children are such a blessing." Of course, at the workhouse, we see children who've been damaged by their experiences. Sometimes they attach themselves to the first kind adults they meet, creating elaborate fantasies about their past troubles. It's quite heartbreaking, really. The manipulation was subtle but clear. Whitmore was preparing them for the possibility that Hope might have filled their heads with lies about him. Ben felt his anger building like pressure in a steam boiler, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Well, Reverend, I appreciate you stopping by, but I'm afraid we can't help you." Whitmore's smile grew sharper, more predatory. "Of course. But perhaps you wouldn't mind if we searched your outbuildings, just to put our minds at ease. This child is quite clever at hiding, and we're so worried about her well-being." The request wasn't really a request. It was a demand wrapped in politeness, backed by the implicit threat of the two hard-faced men now returning from the well. Ben realized with growing alarm that Whitmore had no intention of leaving empty-handed. "I'm afraid I can't allow that," Ben said quietly, his hand moving subtly closer to his rifle. "This is private property, and you have no legal authority here." "Legal authority?" Whitmore's mask of benevolence began to slip, revealing something cold and hungry beneath. "Mr. Crawford, I am a man of God, charged with the care of lost souls. That girl is legally bound to our institution. Interfering with my rightful authority would be inadvisable." The threat was out in the open now, and Ben felt the familiar calm that had served him well during cavalry charges settle over his mind. He'd faced down Confederate sharpshooters and Apache war parties. 3 bullies with religious pretensions didn't intimidate him. "Reverend," he said, straightening to his full height, "I think it's time you and your men moved along. There's nothing for you here." Whitmore's facade cracked completely, revealing the fanatic beneath the preacher's robes. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, Crawford. That girl is a liar and a thief. She belongs to me, and I will have her back." "She belongs to herself," Margaret said suddenly, stepping forward with the courage that had carried her through battlefield hospitals. "No child belongs to anyone. They're gifts from God, not property to be owned." "Blasphemy!" Whitmore's voice cracked like a whip. "Children are born in sin and must be purified through suffering. That girl has filled your heads with poison, turned you against God's holy work. But I know her true nature." Ben had heard enough. His rifle was in his hand so smoothly that Whitmore's men barely had time to react, their own weapons half drawn before they found themselves staring down the barrel of a Springfield rifle held by a man who'd learned to kill efficiently and without hesitation. "Get off my land," Ben said quietly, his voice carrying the deadly calm of a man who'd crossed the line from talking to acting. "Now." For a moment the tableau held, 3 against 2, weapons drawn, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the ranch yard like fingers reaching toward violence. Then Whitmore raised his hand, stopping his men from drawing their guns completely. "This isn't over, Crawford. That girl is mine by law and by God's will. I'll be back with the proper authorities, and when I am, you'll regret interfering with divine justice." They mounted up and rode away, but Ben could feel their hatred lingering like smoke in the air. As soon as they disappeared over the ridge, Hope emerged from the barn, her face white with terror. "He found me," she whispered, collapsing into Margaret's waiting arms. "After 3 years, he finally found me." "It's all right," Margaret murmured, stroking Hope's hair. "We won't let him take you." But Ben knew it wasn't all right. Whitmore had the law on his side, at least the corrupted version of law that existed on the frontier, where religious authority often trumped individual rights. More than that, The Reverend had the fanatic's certainty that God approved of his actions, making him infinitely more dangerous than simple greed or lust for power. That night, as they sat around the dinner table, 3 plates finally filled as Margaret had dreamed, Ben made a decision that would change all their lives forever. "Hope," he said carefully, "I need you to tell me everything you remember about Whitmore's operation. Every detail, no matter how small. Every name, every face, every piece of information you can recall." "Why?" she asked, though her eyes already seemed to know the answer. "Because running isn't enough anymore. He'll keep coming, keep hunting you, until someone stops him permanently. And if the law won't protect you," Ben's weathered hands clenched into fists, "then we'll have to protect you ourselves." Margaret reached across the table, covering both their hands with her own. "Whatever we do it as a family. That's what families do. They protect each other, no matter the cost." Hope looked between them, these 2 strangers who'd become her whole world in the space of a month, and felt something she'd thought lost forever, the warmth of unconditional love. But underneath that warmth ran a current of fear, because she knew what Josiah Whitmore was capable of when crossed. "There are other children," she said quietly. "At the workhouse. Dozens of them. If we're going to stop him, we need to save them too. All of them." Ben nodded grimly. "Then that's what we'll do. But first we need to be ready for when he comes back. Because he will come back, and next time he won't be asking politely." Outside, the desert wind howled through the darkness, carrying with it the promise of storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The attack came 3 nights later, just before dawn, when the desert air hung cold and still. Hope jerked awake to the sound of horses' hooves thundering across the hardpan, her body responding to danger before her mind fully grasped what was happening. She'd learned to sleep like a wild animal during her years on the run, lightly, with one ear always listening for the sounds that meant death was riding toward her. "Ben! Margaret!" she called out, scrambling from her bed as orange light flickered against her bedroom window. Fire! The bastards were trying to burn them out. Ben was already up, his military training having awakened him at the first sound of approaching riders. He appeared in Hope's doorway fully dressed, his rifle in one hand and a cartridge belt slung over his shoulder. "How many?" he asked tersely, moving to the window. Hope pressed her face against the glass, counting the shadowy figures surrounding their home. 6 riders, maybe more. "They've got torches and—" She sucked in a sharp breath. "That's Whitmore in front. He's got something in his hands." The something turned out to be a speaking trumpet through which the Reverend's voice now boomed across the ranch yard with righteous fury. "Crawford, I know the girl is in there. Send her out now, and no harm will come to you and your wife. This is your final warning." Ben cursed under his breath, recognizing the tactical impossibility of their situation. 6 men with rifles and fire against 2 adults and a girl, with no cover except the house itself. During the war, he'd have called this a suicide mission. Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs, her hair in a nighttime braid, but her eyes fully alert. She carried a shotgun with the casual competence of a frontier woman who'd learned that survival sometimes required violence. "The root cellar?" she asked quietly. "No," Hope said firmly, surprising them both. "If I hide and you get killed protecting me, I'll never forgive myself. We face this together, as a family." Through the speaking trumpet, Whitmore's voice rose with evangelical fervor. "The girl belongs to the Lord's work. She is bound by sacred covenant to serve in his house of correction. Any who interfere with divine justice will face eternal damnation." "Crazy son of a bitch," Ben muttered, then looked apologetically at Margaret. "Sorry, dear." "Under the circumstances, I think stronger language is warranted," she replied dryly, pumping her shotgun with a sound that would have made a cavalry sergeant proud. The first shot shattered the front window, sending glass cascading across the parlor floor. Ben immediately returned fire, his bullet taking one of Whitmore's men clean out of the saddle. The man screamed as he hit the ground, clutching his shoulder where blood bloomed dark against his shirt. "You killed Brother Samuel!" someone shouted from the darkness. "He ain't dead," Ben called back, "but the next shot will be." Hope found herself oddly calm in the chaos of gunfire and shouting. Perhaps it was because she'd lived with fear for so long that actual danger felt almost like relief. Finally, the waiting was over. She moved through the house with purpose, collecting ammunition and supplies while bullets whined through the air above her head. Margaret had positioned herself at the kitchen window, her shotgun covering the rear approach to the house. "They're trying to flank us," she called out as two riders circled toward the back of the property. The battle raged for 20 minutes that felt like hours. Ben's military experience showed in his tactical thinking. He moved from window to window, never firing twice from the same position, conserving ammunition while making every shot count. Margaret's nursing background had taught her to stay calm under pressure, and her frontier upbringing had taught her to shoot straight. But it was Hope who turned the tide. During a brief lull in the gunfire, she appeared at Ben's elbow with a grim smile and a stick of dynamite. "Where in hell did you get that?" he asked, staring at the explosive. "Found it in your barn. Figure you use it for clearing stumps?" "Hope, that's dangerous as a rattlesnake in a cradle. You don't know how to—" "I know enough." Her blue eyes held steady on his. "I watched the railroad crews when I was running, light the fuse, throw hard, and get down fast, right?" Before Ben could argue, another volley of shots peppered the house, one bullet passing so close to his head that he felt the wind of its passage. Outside, Whitmore's voice rose in fevered preaching. "The wicked flee when no man pursueth, but the righteous are bold as lions. Send forth the child, that she may be cleansed of her sins through holy suffering." "That man's plumb loco," Margaret observed, reloading her shotgun. Hope was already moving toward the front door, the dynamite clutched in her small hands. "Keep them busy for 30 seconds, she told Ben. "Then everyone get down." "Hope, no! It's too dangerous." But she was already gone, slipping out the back door like smoke while Ben and Margaret opened fire to cover her escape. Hope moved through the desert darkness with the silent grace of a ghost, years of running and hiding having taught her how to become invisible when necessary. She circled wide around Whitmore's position, using a small arroyo to mask her approach. The Reverend and his remaining men were so focused on the house that they never saw the slight figure creeping up behind them until it was too late. Hope lit the dynamite fuse with a burning stick she'd grabbed from one of their abandoned torches. The fizzing sound seemed impossibly loud in the stillness, but Whitmore's men were making enough noise with their own shooting to miss it. "Hey, Reverend!" Hope called out, standing up in full view. Whitmore spun around, his eyes widening as he saw her. "There! The demon child! Take her alive!" "Go to hell," Hope replied calmly, and threw the dynamite. The explosion shattered the desert silence like the fist of God, sending men and horses flying in all directions. The blast knocked Hope flat, her ears ringing and her vision swimming, but she could see through the dust and smoke that her desperate gambit had worked. 3 of Whitmore's men were down, their horses scattered to the 4 winds. The others were staggering around in confusion, temporarily deafened and disoriented. Ben and Margaret rushed from the house, Ben's rifle ready to finish what Hope had started. But when the smoke cleared, they found only one figure still standing in the wreckage. Josiah Whitmore himself had survived the blast, though his black coat was torn and bloody. He stood swaying in the crater Hope's dynamite had carved from the earth, his gray hair wild with dust and his eyes burning with fanatic fury. In his hands he clutched a long knife that gleamed wickedly in the firelight. "The Lord protects his servants," he screamed, raising the blade above his head. "No weapon formed against me shall prosper. The girl is mine by divine right." He lunged at Hope, who was still struggling to clear her head from the explosion's effects. For a moment that stretched like eternity, it seemed that Whitmore's blade would find its mark, that 3 years of running would end in blood and madness. Then Margaret's shotgun spoke with final authority. The blast took Whitmore full in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him face first into the dust. He tried once to rise, his fingers clawing at the earth, but the effort proved beyond him. With a rattling sigh, Josiah Whitmore died as he had lived, consumed by his own righteousness and the violence it had bred. In the sudden silence that followed, the 3 survivors of the Crawford Ranch looked at each other across the battlefield that had been their home. Hope sat in the dirt, her ears still ringing and her dress torn by flying debris. Margaret stood frozen with her smoking shotgun, staring at the man she'd just killed. Ben moved among the wounded attackers, disarming them and checking for signs of fight still left in them. "Is it over?" Hope asked, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. "It's over," Ben confirmed, kneeling beside one of the wounded men, the same brother Samuel he'd shot in the shoulder. "This one's still breathing. We'll need to get the doctor." Margaret finally lowered her shotgun, her hands shaking with delayed reaction. "I've never killed a man before," she said quietly. "Never wanted to." Hope struggled to her feet and walked over to where Whitmore lay motionless in the dust. Looking down at the body of the man who'd haunted her nightmares for 3 years, she felt not triumph or relief, but a profound emptiness. All that running, all that fear, and it had ended like this, with gunpowder and violence under a desert dawn. "He's really dead?" she asked. "Yes, child. He's dead." Margaret's voice was steady now, the shock giving way to maternal concern. "How do you feel?" Hope considered the question seriously. "Empty," she said finally. "Like I've been carrying a weight for so long that I don't know what to do without it." Ben finished securing the surviving attackers and joined them beside Whitmore's body. "We'll need to contact the territorial marshal, report what happened here. Self-defense is clear enough, but there'll be questions." "What about the other children?" Hope asked suddenly. "The ones still at the workhouse?" "With Whitmore dead, what happens to them?" The question hung in the morning air like smoke from the dying fires. In their focus on survival and immediate danger, they'd almost forgotten about the dozens of children still trapped in Whitmore's institution of sanctified cruelty. "We'll find them," Ben promised, his voice carrying the weight of a sacred vow. "We'll find them all and bring them home." Margaret looked around at the destruction surrounding their ranch, broken windows, bullet holes in the walls, craters from the dynamite blast. Then she looked at Hope, this fierce girl who'd become the daughter of her heart, and at Ben, the man who'd stood ready to die protecting their found family. "We'll rebuild," she said simply. "All of it. The house, the barns, everything. But this time, we'll build it knowing what we're really defending. Not just property or livestock, but something more precious than all the gold in California." "What's that?" Hope asked. Margaret smiled, reaching out to pull both Hope and Ben into an embrace that smelled of gunpowder and love and the promise of new beginnings. "Home," she said. "We're building a home." The telegram from the territorial marshal arrived 6 days after the battle, its terse message bringing news that shattered what little peace the Crawford family had managed to rebuild. Ben read it aloud in the kitchen while Margaret stirred a pot of stew with trembling hands, and Hope sat frozen at the table, her face white as bleached bone. "Marshal Thompson regrets to inform that Christian workhouse found abandoned upon investigation. No children present. Building shows signs of hasty evacuation. Reverend Whitmore's associates believed to have relocated operation. Investigation continues. The silence that followed was more devastating than any explosion. Hope's hands clenched into fists so tight her knuckles went bloodless, and Margaret's wooden spoon clattered to the floor as the implications sank in. "They're gone," Hope whispered, her voice cracking like dry wood. "All those children, and they're gone because of me. Because I brought death to their doorstep." "No," Ben said firmly, but Hope was already pushing back from the table, her chair scraping against the wooden floor with a sound like fingernails on a coffin lid. "Don't you see? This is my fault. Whitmore's dead, but his people knew he was coming here. When he didn't come back, they knew I'd killed him or gotten him killed. So they ran, and they took the children with them to God knows where." Margaret bent to retrieve her spoon, her movements mechanical and numb. "Dozens of them," she said quietly. "Little ones who never had a chance." The weight of collective guilt settled over the ranch like a shroud. They had saved themselves, protected their small circle of love and belonging, but in doing so had doomed countless other innocents to continued suffering in some new hell that Whitmore's disciples would carve from the wilderness. That night, Hope didn't come to dinner. Margaret found her hours later in the barn, sitting in the hayloft with her old traveling bag clutched in her lap and her few possessions scattered around her like the remnants of a broken life. "I have to go," Hope said without looking up when Margaret's footsteps creaked on the ladder. "I have to find them. It's the only way to make this right." Margaret settled beside her with the careful movements of a woman who understood that the wrong word could shatter something precious beyond repair. "Child, you can't save the world by destroying yourself." "Can't I?" Hope's blue eyes blazed with desperate purpose. "I know Whitmore's methods, his contacts, the way his network operates. I'm the only one who can track down where they went. But I can't do it from here, safe and comfortable, while children suffer because of my choices." "Your choices?" Margaret's voice carried the sharp edge of a woman pushed beyond patience. "Hope Sullivan, you listen to me. You were a victim, not a perpetrator. That madman's crimes aren't your responsibility. Tell that to the children he's torturing in some new prison tonight." The words hung in the dusty air between them like a curse. Margaret wanted to argue, to point out the twisted logic that blamed the victim for the villain's actions, but she could see the terrible resolve building in Hope's eyes, the same determination that had helped her survive 3 years on the run. "If you go," Margaret said carefully, "you'll break Ben's heart. You'll break mine too." Hope's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her cheeks like desert rain. "Don't you think leaving breaks my heart too? This is the first real home I've ever had. You and Ben are the first people who ever loved me without wanting something in return. But how can I enjoy that love knowing it cost other children their freedom?" Margaret pulled Hope into her arms, feeling the girl's thin shoulders shake with grief that went deeper than tears could wash clean. "Then we'll find another way. All of us, together. That's what families do. They face impossible problems as a unit, not as individuals carrying guilt they don't deserve." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret felt the cold certainty settling in her bones that their peaceful ranch life was ending before it had truly begun. The forces Whitmore had set in motion would continue grinding forward like some infernal machine, and the only question was whether the Crawford family would be crushed beneath its wheels or find the strength to fight back. Ben found them there an hour later, 2 women holding each other against the weight of a broken world. When Margaret explained Hope's intentions, his weathered face showed no surprise, only the grim acceptance of a man who'd seen enough war to recognize when the battle lines were being drawn. "If we're going after them," he said quietly, "we'll need help. More help than 3 people can provide." Hope pulled back from Margaret's embrace, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "What do you mean?" Ben was quiet for a long moment, as if wrestling with a decision that would change everything they'd built together. Finally, he reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a worn leather folder. Inside was a badge, not the simple star of a local sheriff, but the distinctive shield of a Pinkerton detective. "My name isn't really Benjamin Crawford," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years of carefully constructed lies. "It's Benjamin Callahan, and for the past 5 years I've been working undercover for the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, investigating child trafficking operations across the Southwest." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Margaret stared at her husband of 20 years as if seeing a stranger, while Hope's mind raced through all the small inconsistencies she'd noticed: his unusual competence with firearms, his knowledge of law enforcement procedures, the way he'd handled Whitmore's attack with military precision. 20 years, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. 20 years of marriage, and you never told me. I couldn't. Ben's face showed the toll of carrying such secrets. Pinkerton agents' families become targets. The less you knew, the safer you were. But after we took Hope in, after I saw what Whitmore was capable of, I realized the case had become personal. I started planning to retire, to tell you both the truth and try to build a real life here. But now the children are gone, Hope said, understanding flooding her features. And you think your Pinkerton contacts can help find them? Ben nodded grimly. We've been tracking Whitmore's organization for years. He's part of a larger network that stretches from California to Texas, maybe beyond. With him dead, his lieutenants will try to reconsolidate somewhere else, but they'll need time to establish new operations. If we move fast, we might be able to find them before they disappear completely. Hope finished. Margaret looked between her husband and the girl she'd come to love as a daughter, seeing the same desperate hope burning in both their eyes. Part of her wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all. She'd finally found the family she'd dreamed of for decades, only to have duty and conscience threaten to tear it apart again. But another part of her, the part that had carried wounded soldiers through field hospitals and held dying boys while they called for their mothers, understood that some fights were too important to walk away from. "How dangerous?" she asked Ben, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her heart. "Extremely. These people have killed to protect their operations before, and they won't hesitate to do it again. If we do this, we'll be putting everything at risk, our lives, our home, our future together." Hope stood up, her traveling bag forgotten at her feet. "Then we'd better make sure we don't fail, because I won't live the rest of my life knowing I could have saved those children and chose safety instead." Margaret rose as well, brushing hay from her skirts with brisk efficiency. "How long do we have to prepare?" "The Pinkerton office in Denver can have agents here within the week," Ben replied. "But Hope's right about the timing being critical. Every day we wait is another day those children spend in hell." "Then we'd better get started," Margaret said, surprising them both with the steel in her voice. "I didn't spend 3 years nursing soldiers back to health just to let children suffer when I could do something about it. This family fights together or it doesn't fight at all." As they walked back toward the house through the desert darkness, Hope felt something she'd almost forgotten: the terrible, wonderful burden of hope itself. The Crawford Ranch might not be the safe haven she'd dreamed of, but it had given her something more precious than safety: a family worth fighting for and the strength to fight for others who had no one else. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new uncertainties, new reasons to run, but tonight they would plan their war against the darkness. 3 unlikely soldiers in a battle for the souls of children they'd never met but refused to abandon. The fight for their peaceful life was over. The fight for justice was just beginning. The Pinkerton agents arrived on a Tuesday morning that dawned gray and bitter, matching the grim purpose that had settled over the Crawford ranch like funeral shrouds. Agent Marcus Delacroix stepped down from the dust-covered wagon with the measured movements of a man who'd seen too much violence to waste energy on unnecessary motion. Behind him came Agent Sarah Chen, her dark eyes scanning the ranch perimeter with professional thoroughness, and Dr. Samuel Porter, the same town doctor who'd been feeding information to Whitmore, now trembling with the desperate hope of redemption. Ben watched from the porch as his former colleagues surveyed the battle-scarred ranch yard, taking note of the bullet holes in the barn walls and the crater where Hope's dynamite had torn the earth. 5 years of carefully constructed cover identity crumbled in their presence, leaving him feeling exposed and strangely vulnerable. "Agent Callahan," Delacroix said, extending his hand with formal courtesy that couldn't quite hide the reproach in his voice. "You missed your last 3 scheduled reports." "I had complications," Ben replied tersely, gesturing toward Hope, who stood beside Margaret with the wary posture of someone expecting betrayal even from allies. "So we gathered." Delacroix's gaze lingered on Hope with calculating interest. "This is the witness who saw Whitmore murder his wife?" "I'm standing right here," Hope said sharply. "You can ask me directly." Agent Chen stepped forward with a slight smile. "We prefer to hear testimony firsthand when possible, Miss Sullivan. Would you be willing to share what you remember about the workhouse operations? Even small details could help us track where the children were taken." Hope exchanged glances with Margaret and Ben, seeing the encouragement in their faces. For weeks she'd carried the weight of her memories alone, but now she had the chance to transform her pain into purpose. "Whitmore kept detailed records," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Every child who came through the workhouse was cataloged: age, background, special skills. He sold the information to buyers across the territory who had specific requirements." Dr. Porter stepped forward, his face pale with shame. "I can confirm that. He forced me to examine every new arrival and report on their physical condition. I thought I was protecting my own daughter by cooperating, but I was complicit in horrors I can barely comprehend." "Your daughter Sarah is safe," Agent Chen assured him gently. "We recovered her from a holding facility in Nevada 3 days ago." Porter's knees buckled with relief, and Ben caught him before he could fall. "She's alive? Truly alive?" "Alive and asking for her father," Delacroix confirmed. "But she's also terrified and traumatized. The psychological scars from these operations run deeper than physical wounds." Margaret moved closer to Hope, her maternal instincts responding to the pain she heard in the agent's words. "How many children are we talking about? How large is this network?" Agent Chen consulted a leather-bound notebook, her expression growing darker as she read. "Based on our investigations across 4 territories, we estimate at least 200 children have passed through Whitmore's network in the past 5 years. Most were sold into various forms of exploitation: factory work, domestic servitude, worse things." The number hit like a physical blow. Hope felt the world spin around her as she imagined 200 young faces, 200 stories of innocence destroyed by systematic cruelty. Her own suffering, terrible as it had been, was merely a single thread in a vast web of exploitation. "Where are they taking the survivors from the workhouse?" Ben asked, his detective instincts focusing on actionable intelligence. "We believe they're moving north toward Colorado," Delacroix replied, spreading a map across the porch table. "There's an abandoned mining town called Silver Creek, about 60 miles from Denver. Perfect isolation, existing buildings that could be fortified, and a network of abandoned tunnels for disposal." The euphemism hung in the air like a death sentence. Hope understood what wasn't being said. Children who became too troublesome, too damaged, or too old would simply disappear into those tunnels forever. "How long do we have?" Margaret asked, her nursing background making her acutely aware of how quickly children could be broken by systematic abuse. Based on travel time and the logistics of moving that many people without attracting attention, perhaps 2 weeks before they're fully established in the new location, Agent Chen estimated. After that, mounting any kind of rescue operation becomes exponentially more difficult. Dr. Porter looked up from where he sat on the porch steps, his face haggard but determined. "I know their medical procedures, their methods of keeping children compliant through calculated malnutrition and drug administration. If you're planning a rescue operation, you'll need someone who understands how to treat withdrawal and trauma symptoms." "This isn't a social call," Delacroix said bluntly. "The Pinkerton Agency doesn't typically involve civilians in active operations, especially operations this dangerous." "Then you'll fail," Hope said with quiet conviction. "Those children have been taught to fear all adults, to expect betrayal from anyone who offers help. They won't trust agents in suits carrying badges. But they might trust someone who survived the same hell they're living through." Ben felt a surge of pride mixed with terror as he watched Hope stand her ground against trained professionals. In 6 weeks, she'd grown from a terrified runaway into a young woman capable of facing down authority figures twice her age. "The girl has a point," Agent Chen acknowledged. "Our previous attempts to infiltrate similar operations have failed because the children were too traumatized to cooperate with rescue efforts." Margaret stepped forward, her jaw set with determination that reminded Ben why he'd fallen in love with her 20 years ago. "If Hope goes, I go. Those children will need medical care the moment they're freed, and Dr. Porter can't handle 24 traumatized patients by himself." "Margaret, no," Ben said firmly. "This is too dangerous. If something happens to you, if something happens to me, you'll grieve and move on, because that's what people do," she interrupted. "But if we don't try to save those children, we'll spend the rest of our lives knowing we could have made a difference and chose safety instead." The argument that followed revealed the fault lines that ran through their hastily assembled alliance. The Pinkerton agents wanted a surgical strike with minimal civilian involvement. Dr. Porter advocated for a medical approach focused on treating the children's immediate physical needs. Hope insisted that any plan not centered on gaining the children's trust would fail catastrophically. It was Margaret who finally cut through the debate with prairie practical logic. "We're wasting time we don't have," she said sharply. "Those children are suffering right now while we stand here arguing about jurisdiction and protocol. Agent Delacroix, what resources can the Pinkerton Agency provide?" 6 agents, including myself and Chen, limited ammunition and supplies. Authority to coordinate with local law enforcement, though that's questionable in Colorado territory. "Dr. Porter, what medical supplies do you need?" Porter consulted a mental inventory developed through years of frontier medicine. "Laudanum for pain management, carbolic acid for wound treatment, clean bandages, nutritional supplements if we can get them." "Hope, what do you know about Silver Creek's layout?" Hope closed her eyes, accessing memories she'd tried to forget. "Whitmore mentioned it during planning sessions I overheard. Old mining town, maybe 30 buildings, most of them connected by underground tunnels. One main road in and out, but the tunnels could provide alternate escape routes if you knew the layout." "Which you don't," Agent Delacroix pointed out. "No, but I know someone who might." Hope's eyes snapped open with sudden inspiration. "There was another girl at the workhouse, older than me, named Catherine Winters. She'd been there longer than anyone since she was 8 years old. Whitmore used her to train new arrivals because she knew all his methods and routines." "You think she's with the group moving to Silver Creek?" "I know she is. Whitmore would never abandon his most valuable asset. If anyone knows how to navigate that facility, it's Catherine. But more importantly, If anyone can convince the other children to trust us, it's her. Agent Chen made notes in her notebook, the scratching of her pencil loud in the desert silence. So our mission becomes a two-part operation. Infiltrate the facility and extract not just the children, but this Catherine Winters, who can help coordinate the rescue. Exactly. But we need to understand something. Hope's voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. These children have been taught that escape attempts result in death. They've seen friends disappear for showing the smallest signs of rebellion. Convincing them to trust us will be harder than fighting our way in. As the sun reached its zenith, casting sharp shadows across the ranch yard, the unlikely alliance began to take shape. Plans were drawn, responsibilities assigned, and the terrible arithmetic of rescue calculated. But underneath all the tactical planning lay a simple truth that none of them spoke aloud. They were about to walk into hell itself, and not all of them would walk back out. The journey to Silver Creek took 8 days through terrain that seemed designed by God to break the spirits of honest travelers. The abandoned mining town clung to the side of a Colorado mountain like a scab on wounded earth, its weathered buildings casting long shadows in the thin autumn air. From their concealed position among the pine trees, the rescue party could see smoke rising from several chimneys and the movement of figures in the dusty streets below. Hope crouched beside Agent Chen, studying the layout through a brass spyglass that revealed details that made her stomach clench with familiar dread. The main building, formerly the mining company's headquarters, had been converted into what could only be described as a fortress. Wooden bars covered every window, and armed guards patrolled the perimeter with the casual efficiency of men accustomed to violence. "There," Hope whispered, pointing to a smaller building connected to the main structure by a covered walkway. "That's where they'll keep the newer children, the ones who haven't been broken yet. The older ones, the ones like Catherine, they'll be in the main building where Whitmore's lieutenants can watch them constantly." Agent Delacroix lowered his own spyglass with a grim expression. "I count at least 12 armed men, probably more inside the buildings. This isn't a rescue operation anymore. It's a military assault." Ben studied the approaches to the town, his cavalry training automatically cataloging defensive positions and potential weaknesses. "The mine tunnels Hope mentioned. Do we know which buildings connect to them?" "Most of them," Dr. Porter replied, consulting a hand-drawn map he'd sketched from memory. "Whitmore showed me the layout once, boasting about how no child could escape because every exit was monitored. But he was also paranoid about cave-ins, so there are emergency exits he probably didn't tell his current people about." Margaret checked her medical supplies for the 10th time, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. "How long do we have once we start, before they realize what's happening and start killing children to eliminate witnesses?" "Minutes," Agent Chen said bluntly. "These people have faced exposure before. Their response will be swift and brutal." The plan they'd developed was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its scope. Hope and Dr. Porter would approach the main building under cover of darkness, presenting themselves as new arrivals sent by Whitmore's network. Once inside, they would locate Catherine Winters and begin organizing the children for escape through the mine tunnels. Meanwhile, Ben, Margaret, and the Pinkerton agents would position themselves at the tunnel exits to receive the children as they emerged. "If this goes wrong," Ben said quietly, looking at his wife and the girl who'd become their daughter, "if we're discovered before we can get the children out—" "We won't be," Hope said with fierce conviction. "I know these people, know how they think. They expect broken children and cooperative adults. They won't be prepared for resistance until it's too late." As night fell over Silver Creek, the rescue party moved into position with the coordinated precision of a military operation. Hope felt her heart pounding as she and Dr. Porter approached the main building, their footsteps muffled by the thin mountain air. Everything depended on the next few minutes. on her ability to convincingly play the role of a victim returning to captivity. The guard who answered their knock was a young man with dead eyes and the casual cruelty of someone who'd learned to enjoy others' suffering. "What do you want?" "Brother Marcus sent us from the Tucson facility," Hope said, pitching her voice to carry the defeated tone she remembered from her fellow prisoners. "He said you needed experienced workers for the new operation." The guard studied them suspiciously, but Hope could see the moment when greed overcame caution in his expression. Experienced workers, children who wouldn't require breaking, were valuable commodities in Whitmore's network. "Wait here," he ordered, disappearing back into the building. Dr. Porter gripped his medical bag tighter, knowing that inside those walls, dozens of children waited in darkness for a salvation they'd been taught to believe would never come. Tonight, that belief would finally be proven wrong. The door opened again, and they stepped across the threshold into hell itself. The interior of the converted mining headquarters reeked of unwashed bodies, fear, and something else that made Hope's stomach turn, the metallic scent of blood barely masked by harsh lye soap. Brother Marcus, Whitmore's second-in-command, emerged from the shadows like a spider sensing vibration in his web. His pale eyes studied Hope and Dr. Porter with the calculating hunger of a predator evaluating fresh prey. "So," Marcus said, his voice carrying the same pseudo-religious cadence that had made Whitmore so terrifyingly effective, "the prodigal daughter returns. I wondered when you'd surface again, Hope Sullivan." Hope felt ice form in her veins, but she forced herself to maintain the defeated posture she'd perfected during her years of captivity. "I got tired of running, tired of being hungry and cold and alone. At least here I know what to expect." Marcus circled them slowly, his boots clicking against the wooden floor with metronomic precision. "And you brought us a doctor." "How convenient. Brother Samuel's shoulder hasn't healed properly since your little explosive tantrum at the Crawford place." Dr. Porter stepped forward, his medical bag clutched like a shield against his chest. "I treated children at Reverend Whitmore's facility before. I understand the special requirements of this work." "Special requirements?" Marcus smiled, and Hope suppressed a shudder at the expression. "Yes, our charges do require careful handling. Broken spirits mend more reliably than broken bones, wouldn't you agree, Doctor?" Through the walls, Hope could hear the sounds that had haunted her nightmares: children weeping, the shuffle of small feet on wooden floors, and underneath it all, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow hope itself. But she also heard something else: whispered voices carrying the distinct cadence of organized resistance. Catherine Winters was still alive, and she was planning something. "I'd like to see the children, Dr. Porter said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, "to assess their medical needs and determine what supplies might be required." Marcus gestured toward a heavily barred door. "Of course, but first, you should understand the rules. These children have been infected by worldly corruption. They require constant spiritual supervision to prevent backsliding into sin. Any sign of rebellion, any attempt to fill their heads with false hope, will be met with immediate correction." He led them through a maze of interconnected rooms that had been carved from the original mining company offices. Hope cataloged every detail: guard positions, locked doors, the location of windows, the sound of footsteps from levels above and below. Her training in survival had taught her that escape routes must be memorized within minutes of arrival because opportunity rarely announced itself. The children's dormitory was a sight that would have broken lesser souls. 36 young faces turned toward them as they entered, ages ranging from perhaps 6 to 16. They sat on thin mattresses arranged in precise rows, their clothing little more than rags, their eyes holding the hollow quality of spirits systematically crushed by calculated cruelty. But Hope saw something else in those faces, a flicker of recognition when their gazes met hers, and underneath the learned helplessness, a spark of defiant intelligence that Marcus and his followers had failed to completely extinguish. "Catherine Winters," Marcus called out, and a girl near the back of the room stood with the careful movements of someone who'd learned that sudden gestures brought punishment. She was perhaps 18 now, though malnutrition had left her looking younger, her dark hair shorn close to her scalp and her brown eyes holding secrets that could topple kingdoms. "Yes, Brother Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the proper tone of submission that Hope remembered learning during her own captivity. "Show our new doctor the medical station. Explain the children's current treatment regimen." Marcus turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Oh, and Catherine, I trust you'll help our returning sister readjust to life among the faithful. She's been infected by worldly influences and may require guidance." After Marcus left, the room fell into the kind of silence that only existed in places where speaking freely could mean death. Hope moved among the children with Dr. Porter, noting the signs of systematic abuse, carefully placed bruises that wouldn't show on clothed bodies, the telltale marks of restraints on wrists and ankles, the hollow-eyed stare of children who'd learned that hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. But she also noted something else. The way Catherine's eyes tracked every movement, the subtle hand signals she made to other children when Marcus wasn't watching, the carefully organized way supplies were distributed despite the apparent chaos. When Dr. Porter knelt to examine a young boy's infected wound, Catherine moved closer to Hope with movements so casual they appeared accidental. "Tonight," Catherine whispered, her lips barely moving. "Third bell after midnight. The tunnels under the old assay office connect to the eastern exit. Can you get word to your people?" Hope's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her expression neutral. "How many children can move without help?" 22. "The others are too weak or too frightened. We'll need to carry some of the little ones." "Guards? 4 at night, 2 outside, 2 patrolling the tunnels. But there's something else." Catherine's eyes held a warning that made Hope's blood chill. "Marcus isn't planning to keep this facility operational much longer. Tomorrow night he's planning to eliminate the children who can't work and move the others to a new location in Mexico." The words hit like physical blows. Tomorrow night, less than 18 hours away. If they didn't succeed tonight, dozens of children would disappear forever into a hellscape that would make Whitmore's operation look merciful by comparison. "Can you get them ready?" Hope asked. "They've been ready for months," Catherine replied with quiet intensity. "We've just been waiting for someone we could trust to get us out." That evening, as the children were served their meager dinner of watery soup and stale bread, Hope began spreading the word through the subtle communication network Catherine had established. A touch on a shoulder here, a whispered phrase there, meaningful glances exchanged across the dormitory. These children had developed their own language of resistance, born from desperate hope and nurtured by Catherine's careful leadership. Dr. Porter moved among them with professional calm, treating minor injuries and administering what medical care he could with his limited supplies. But Hope could see the rage building behind his eyes as he catalogued the systematic cruelty that had been inflicted on these innocent souls. As the guards prepared to lock them in for the night, Hope caught Catherine's eye one final time. The older girl nodded almost imperceptibly, and Hope felt a surge of something she'd almost forgotten during her years of running, the fierce joy of righteous purpose. Outside in the Colorado mountains, Ben, Margaret, and the Pinkerton agents waited in positions around the tunnel exits, their weapons ready and their hearts heavy with the knowledge that everything depended on the next few hours. They'd seen enough of these operations to understand the stakes: rescue or massacre, with no middle ground between salvation and slaughter. At 11 o'clock, Hope lay on her thin mattress, listening to the sounds of the facility settling into its nighttime routine. Guards changing shifts, the creak of old wood adjusting to temperature changes, the whispered prayers of children who still believed someone might be listening. At midnight, she heard the first bell toll from the old mining company clock tower. At 1 o'clock, the second bell. At 2 o'clock, the third bell echoed across the mountain valley like a call to arms. Hope opened her eyes in the darkness and saw 35 other pairs of eyes staring back at her, bright with desperate courage and the terrible beauty of souls refusing to accept defeat. Catherine Winters stood at the center of the room like a general preparing for the battle that would determine whether they lived as free children or died as symbols of resistance. "Tonight," Catherine whispered, "we go home." The children of Silver Creek rose in silence, ready to follow their leaders into either freedom or death, but determined never again to accept the chains that had bound their spirits for far too long.